Well, hello, folks. How you doing? I'm Steve Gilly, along here with Rod Mullins, and we're trying something different this week, aren't we, Rod?
Yes, if you want to call it different. I'm a little bit scared, reluctant when I hear this. When you say we're trying something new, that's like a proctologist saying, "I'm going to try something new this week." Okay.
Only a problem if it comes over you with a gloved hand. That's all you got to worry about.
That's anyway, or an ungloved hand.
Anyway, what we're doing, folks, other than being a little bit silly here, we are trying something a little bit different, as I said. Something a little bit more along the lines of a practice run for some live streaming that we're thinking about doing on the channel. What we're going to do today is talk a little bit about some of the short films that we did last week and tell you a little bit more about those, and then get into a few other things, maybe some house cleaning things, some general stuff, and open the floors up for any questions y'all might have that you might want to put down in the comments down below. And we urge you to please put something down in the comments, because we love to read those comments and like to have a conversation with you. So, Rod, this week I posted a video about the Appalachian earthquake that happened in 1897 up in Giles County. And I don't know if you've seen that or not, but we did do that as a podcast at one time, if you remember.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it was a very interesting bit there. And some folks did ask whether or not we were going to tell any more about it. Said the video was kind of short, which that was intentional, because we're mainly a podcast, not so much filmmakers. So a little bit of background on this. If you all are aware, and I'm sure most of you are, back in 1811 and 1812, there were a series of earthquakes out in a place called New Madrid. Well, it's New Madrid, Missouri now, right on the Missouri-Tennessee border. The largest earthquakes ever to happen east of the Rocky Mountains, ever. I think like, what was it, Rod, 7 to 8 on the Richter scale is what they figured that would be?
Yeah. They thought it was pretty close to about 8. So we'll just say in that upper part of 7 to around 8. So
lots of damage all over Appalachia, actually all over from the Midwest back to the East Coast. A very violent event that happened back then. This episode that we're talking about in Giles County up near Pearisburg it was the second worst earthquake. And I think there may have been one bigger than that, but I can't swear to it right off the top of my head. But I think they estimated the one in Pearisburg to be between 6 and 7 on the Richter scale, if there had been a Richter scale back then. It happened near the courthouse. And as you saw in the video, it happened when court was going on, which greatly excited the judge and the attorneys there in the courtroom, who ran out as fast as they could run to get out to safety. I don't know that there was a tremendous amount of damage up there in Pearisburg. Rod, do you recollect that? And when we talked about that before?
Not right offhand. I don't know of any kind of damage and stuff. But, I think what's interesting about this too, Steve, is that, there are indications sometimes you're going to have an earthquake, or sometimes it kind of comes suddenly. You don't know. But, there had been things happening at least weeks before this earthquake happened in Pearisburg. I mean, farmers started talking about it, their farms. People were out working in town. They were hearing strange noises. Things had been strange up there leading up to this big event. And then when this thing happened, it just, it was something that I'm sure a lot of people had no idea what this thing was. Some people, I'm sure, probably thought it was like a cannon going off, but they were probably wondering, what in the heck is this? What's going on here?
Yeah, that's what they were saying. Said it sounded like artillery fire. At least the old Confederate veterans said it sounded like that. And as you can imagine, folks were quite upset about it. And the effects were felt all over the part of Appalachia, as far away, I think, as Ohio, if I'm not mistaken. But they had shaking down in Bristol. Bricks fell out of the sides of buildings. obviously Withville, they were in a panic. I guess that was probably one of the closer places to it. Pearisburg, I don't think got hit quite that bad. I think after the initial shock, it kind of settled down. But then you get out away from that, different places up through there. There was some damage here and there. I think from Rod, up toward Richmond. I think not quite Richmond, but up toward that way, and then all the way down toward Knoxville. They reported feeling that earthquake. It was actually a big event. The lake they had up there, Mountain Lake, which, by the way, was the only natural lake in this part of the country, they said it started to drain, or there were rumors that it was starting to drain. And it turns out that was not true. Although, from what I understand from comments from people that viewed the video on TikTok and Instagram, that it probably is pretty much drained at this point. Now, whether that's because of a drought or what have you, I don't know. But the pictures I've seen of Mountain Lake show it to be mud lake, to be honest with you.
Wow.
So it was just a horrendous event that happened up there in Giles County.
You were talking about the damage and everything that had taken place. You mentioned about Bristol, Pulaski, which is close if you start looking at it that way. Chimneys were shaken down. This happened to be, I guess, probably a report a lot of people talked about more than anything else. Chimneys being knocked down or shook or whatever the case may be. Yeah. I think what's interesting is the one about Big Stone and Gate City. Of course, houses were shaken, clocks stopped, furniture was jostled about, but the earthquake even triggered an avalanche and causing a bunch of rocks and everything to rain down on the railroad track, causing the derailment of a freight train. And, back in those days, a freight train was the lifeblood. That was the source of getting your goods in and out of a particular area. And so with this derailment of a freight train, I'm sure it took some time for them to be able to, get the train line open again, once again for it. But, it wasn't just in Southwest Virginia, some of these places we mentioned. Of course, you mentioned Knoxville, but, they even talked about Charlotte. They even talked as far away as South Carolina, this happening, which also reminds me of the earthquake they talk about in South Carolina at one time, Charleston, of where they said that it was felt as far north as Southwest Virginia and some of the states along the eastern seaboard. I think one of the things that kind of accounts for that, not damage as much or not that much damage in Pearisburg as opposed to outside, was probably the depth of the earthquake. I think what they say is the deeper the earthquake, sometimes it's not as bad at the epicenter, so to speak, but it depends. It just depends on what's going on with it. And then the land, how it radiates outward from that particular area, depending on what the strata is, it can vibrate or reverberate. It can cause a lot of problems.
Yeah. I think there was a professor that did some studies on that not too long after that and indicated that this whole earthquake that happened up in Giles County was actually, believe it or not, an aftershock of the new Madrid quake, even though it was nearly 100 years afterwards. And I would say that a lot of these other quakes we've felt over the years probably have been the same. I do remember the one a couple of years ago centered in Western North Carolina. It was on a Sunday morning, and I was in my office in the studio that was there at that time working on a podcast episode. And it was probably about 8:30, 8:45. And all of a sudden, I just felt this boom, like somebody hit the building. And I thought somebody had run into the side of the building. So I go out, and there's nothing out there. I come back in. I have no idea what happened. I just finished up what I was doing and then turned on the news through the internet. And there it was, talking about that earthquake that happened right at that time. So I would never have figured that was an earthquake. It felt like somebody had just run into the side of the building with a truck or a car, is what it felt like. And I think You said something about before we started this that you had been through an earthquake.
Right. I've been through an earthquake before. It was probably around 1987. It's when I was working in radio in Big Stone Gap. And I was working at the radio station there and felt like either a mine blast, an explosion. There was some kind of an explosion, a sound though, but a reverberation was what it was. And the first thought that I had, there's the bridge there in Big Stone Gap that a lot of the traffic has to cross over. And I thought maybe it was just a truck. Maybe it was just a truck. Something happened. Could have been a blowout. I mean, who knows what it could have been. And then within minutes, I'm sitting there and then the alarm starts going off on this Okie data printer teletype that we had there in the studio. And next thing I know, there's been an earthquake. And the earthquake was centered over about Middlesboro. And then, although I wasn't in it, but I knew people that felt it. I even think my wife felt it. Was the one that we had, was it 2009, 2010, somewhere in there, about the earthquake that happened up in Louisa County, near Charlottesville, in between Charlottesville and Richmond. That's kind of as the mountains start kind of going out of the Appalachian, so to speak. But I'm telling you, that was felt down in Wise, of all places. It was felt in a number of different places. Hey, this is the same one that closed the Washington Monument down for quite a while until they could go and they could do the restorative work on the Washington Monument. But I can remember my wife saying she was a student at UVA Wise then, and there was a swaying that went on in the building they know as Commonwealth. But it's built kind of strange, won an award for the way it was built, but so forth. But they, it was like a wave. It started kind of a jiggle and a wave in that building. So yeah, that earthquake was felt here. I didn't feel it though. But first time I knew it was when a telephone call from a friend of mine whose daughter actually lived in Lynchburg. Boy, she felt it. She felt it strong when it happened.
Yeah, we're not used to that up here. I mean, we're not from California where they have earthquakes all the time. So it's quite an unusual thing for us here. And I guess it was back then. Although most of the comments that I got, well, a lot of the comments at least, folks had never heard of this. And actually, I'd never heard of it either until we started doing that research to do the story for the podcast a couple of years ago.
Right.
So very, very interesting story. But this is sort of the things that we're wanting to kind of do if we go and do a live stream each week, thinking about maybe doing that on a Thursday night. And we'd like to have your input on that. Would you like to see us do that? Would you like to be involved? Would you be involved in that? We just would like to get a nice conversation going. Be glad to answer whatever questions we can answer and try to just see it, I guess, Rod, as a chance to get together and chat with our viewers. How about that?
Are they going to see our faces on this?
Of course they are. We've got to get some horror part of this.
I mean, you and I both have faces for radio. I mean, that's the way it always has been. But but talking about this, that brings up the possibility if people want to, they can go and they can, ask us questions and talk to us and so forth. Yeah. But then we can open up a whole can of worms with this, something like this, especially with this topic, because I was telling you some things before we sat down to start recording about this. And we talked about fault lines. People, didn't know about faults existing and so forth. And so, this has gone on. This is, the earth moves underneath us almost constantly. We just don't feel it that much, except when those two plates get stuck on each other. And when they finally get stuck and they break free, that's when you feel it. That's when something is going on. So, but I'm just like you. I've been through one, lasted probably more than about 2 seconds, 2 or 3 seconds. And it was the aftermath of what had happened in Middlesboro, I think is where it took place at. And that's kind of coincidence too. We think about Middlesboro and then I think of immediately crater impact. And I start thinking, wow, well, what had happened there and stuff. And then my mind starts going to something else, thinking about that sort of scenario, what that could have been like millions of years ago when it first happened.
Well, luckily, we don't have those earthquakes all the time up here. And,
right.
You know, for those folks that are viewing us from out west where you have gone through a lot of earthquakes, you can keep them. That's all I can say.
Well, we feel for you. We feel for you because, I mean, it's something that is a constant there in the West and stuff. And even when you're in some, I don't know, calm regions and things like that, or so you think is calm, you know, and there are people that go around and say, there's no other place I would rather be except for the mountains. But you know what? We can't get away from earthquakes here. They may not happen as much as what they do in California and places, you know, beyond on the West Coast, but still they happen.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Rod, do you have anything else you want to add before we close this first little bit out?
I don't think so. I think we've covered a lot of things, but we still have more to talk about. If, of course, the listeners and viewers, you know, want to get in here and talk to us about something like this, you know, we've either got the information in front of us or we can get access to the information one way or the other if you're asking us a question about things. But we really want to welcome some people to, you know, join in and sit down with us, talk with us about these things, ask us questions. You know, there's going to be some times that we are going to kind of give, at least the way it is perceived by me, maybe our 2 cents worth about some things, but we're basing it all upon the facts of what we have of things that have happened in Appalachia.
Well, folks, we're looking forward to doing all this, just like Rod said, and we'll see what comes up and what transpires with all this. So until then, y'all take care. So long, everybody.